Imagine a guy who literally rewrote human history. He essentially electrified the modern world, a sprawling, monumental project vastly more complex and important than anything we've managed to accomplish this century. You picture Thomas Edison grinding away in his lab, permanently changing the trajectory of civilization. Naturally, you'd assume a guy like that died with enough money to buy his own sovereign nation, right? But when he finally passed away, his entire estate, adjusted for today's money, was barely $200 million, not even a fraction of a single billion. And then you look at today's self-proclaimed innovators. The moment they float a new tech concept or launch a rocket, what do? They start acting like 18th century monarchs. They retreat to privately owned islands, demand absolute immunity from the law, and casually attempt to buy out government control. Everything grinds to a halt unless they are granted unlimited wealth and status. What really struck me beyond this bizarre historical regression in ego is how easily we've accepted the narrative. This strange modern fan fiction that says, unless we surrender our democracy, fund their pet projects with our tax dollars, and crown these guys as untouchable royalty, human progress will simply cease to exist.
Yeah, that modern fan fiction is exactly what we are unpacking today. It really is a staggering contrast.
It is. And today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly how that massive cultural and economic shift happened. We are pulling from some incredible source material that lays out the historical parallels between the old divine right of kings and this contemporary rise of billionaire theology.
Right. And the mission of this deep dive is to analyze the cyclical nature of these elite power claims. We'll look at their violent historical undoing, too, because it provides such a perfect framework to understand where we are right now.
Exactly. The sources detail the economic mechanisms behind government funding, transhumanism, the whole picture. So let's just jump right into a narrative from the text to anchor this. Picture a guy, let's call him Elias.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. So Elias is standing perfectly still in the center of his 74th floor penthouse. He's adjusting the bespoke, hand-stitched cuffs of his silk shirt.
Completely isolated up in his tower.
Completely. And the ambient lighting in the room is automatically dimming to match his elevated heart rate. Because on his wall-sized monitors, the ones that usually show real-time orbital trajectories or global market fluctuations, he's watching a localized security feed.
Oh, so something is going wrong right at his front door.
Down in his lobby, actually.
Yeah.
The reinforced, bullet-resistant glass is beginning to spiderweb. There's this massive, improvised battering ram wielded by a dozen exhausted, furious people just slamming into the entryway again and again.
Wow. And how is he reacting to this? I mean, is he panicking?
That's the wild part. The structural integrity indicators on his screen flash from cool blue to urgent amber, but he doesn't feel terror. He just feels this profound, suffocating sense of absurdity.
Absurdity, not fear.
Right. He actually mutters to the empty, climate-controlled room, they simply do not understand the math.
They don't understand the math. That's such a telling detail from the text.
Because for over a decade, Elias had been hailed as a titan. He was the singular architect of the future. His staggering wealth was celebrated as the sacred, necessary engine of human progression.
Right, because he built the low Earth orbital habitats.
Exactly. And he personally authored the predictive algorithms that, ironically, mapped the very desires, frustrations, and breaking points of the mob currently breaching his gates.
He essentially coded his own downfall.
But in his own mind, he was fundamentally no different from the absolute monarchs of centuries past. He wasn't chosen by God, but he was undeniably anointed by raw data, by market capitalization, by what he believed was an evolutionary destiny.
He saw himself as the apex of the system.
Yeah, but as the alarms in the penthouse shift from a gentle digital chime to a crude analog wail, the theology of his brilliance fractures. He checks the security telemetry, his private security detail. These highly trained mercenaries paid heavily in company equity, they abandoned their posts 15 minutes ago.
Because the equity is worthless the minute the mob breaks in.
The market realized the physical infrastructure was falling, the algorithms triggered a massive sell-off, and the equity vanished. So Elias walks over to his carbon fiber bar, pours a scotch, his hands trembling. He had genuinely believed his extreme privilege was the necessary sacrifice the world had to make for innovation.
And he was completely, willfully blind to the historical truth. I mean, the sources point this out so clearly. When the elite demand too much from the mud beneath them, the altar is always violently dismantled by the very hands forced to build it.
Exactly. It's a brutal wake-up call.
And that image, a man watching his empire shatter from a glass tower, it perfectly encapsulates the historical cycle of elite power and its inevitable undoing.
So how does the source material break down the mechanics of that power? Like, how does it justify itself?
Well, if we examine how power is justified across centuries, there is a direct, undeniable parallel between the classical divine right of kings and the contemporary rise of what functions as a billionaire theology.
A billionaire theology.
Right. To understand how Elias ended up alone with a glass of scotch, we have to look at how absolute rule is constructed. In the 17th century, monarchs like James I of England or Louis XIV of France, they didn't just claim they were in charge because they had the biggest armies.
They needed an ideological framework.
Exactly. They utilized the divine right. This framework argued that the monarch derived his right to rule directly from the will of God, meaning he wasn't accountable to his subjects, the aristocracy, or any earthly legal institution.
So rebelling against the king was literally rebelling against the structure of the universe itself.
And the modern equivalent of that, according to our sources, is substituting God with the concept of the market or technological progress.
Right. The prevailing narrative you always hear is that these individuals possess this unique, almost mystical ability to see the future and deploy capital.
Yeah. So their wealth isn't just a bank balance. It's a measure of their evolutionary fitness to lead humanity. They argue that democratic institutions, which are, filled with average people and red tape, they're simply incapable of making the harsh, visionary trade-offs required to push the species forward.
That actually echoes Henry David Thoreau's observation during the rapid industrialization of the 19th century. He said, "We do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us."
Action. The argument is that for the railroad of progress to be built at scale, society must submit to the visionaries, granting them unprecedented status, wealth, and legal immunity.
And the historical regression here isn't just theoretical. The text notes how it manifests in their physical behavior. We see modern innovators retreating to private islands, constructing massive underground bunkers.
Demanding customized legal jurisdictions where federal laws just don't apply to their operations.
Right. But historically, royalty failed spectacularly as a ruling mechanism in the modern era. The concentration of all resources at the top while ignoring systemic suffering is a highly volatile state.
Just look at the early 20th century. The catastrophic collapse of the major monarchies during and after World War I. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns.
These weren't just simple changes in government.
No, they were violent systemic explosions caused by a ruling class that believed its own mythology of untouchability right up until the moment the palace doors were breached. The behavior we see today, the dynastic nepotism, hoarding resources that outpace the GDP of entire nations, it's a direct, mechanical regression to that exact failed model.
Because the moment a leader becomes unaccountable to the democratic masses, relying solely on an abstract justification for their power, they break the foundational social contract.
Exactly.
I have to push back here, though, just to bring in the counter perspective from the deep dive. Let's look at this objectively. We are criticizing their egos, but what about the material reality of innovation?
Point there.
There's this fundamental premise in our modern economy that investment equals meritocracy. Someone has to take the massive risk to build the orbital habitats or the electric vehicle infrastructure. Let's use a comic book analogy to break this down. Take Tony Stark.
Iron Man.
Yeah, Iron Man. If his only superpower was inheriting a defense contracting fortune and buying out obscure technologies that other unnamed engineers invented, those comic books wouldn't sell a single copy.
We wouldn't care at all.
Right. The narrative requires him to be a singular, hands-on scientific genius, yet in our actual reality, we treat aggressive capital deployment, literally just moving money from one column to another, as if it is identical to scientific genius.
It's a sleight of hand.
So my question is, how does this myth sustain itself so effectively when history proves it's false? Look at the Thomas Edison example we opened with.
Electrifying cities, building the Pearl Street Station.
Right. Standardizing the power grid was a monumental leap in civilization. It required massive capital, labor, and brilliant engineering. But Edison didn't demand to be a sovereign nation.
He didn't require hundreds of billions of dollars in untaxed wealth to make it happen.
He died wealthy, but his estate was a fraction of what today's founders demand before they even produce a viable product. If innovation worked in the 20th century without creating absolute monarchs, why are we told it's impossible today?
That right there is the crux of the illusion. The myth of the singular genius isn't just an ego trip. It serves a highly specific, vital economic function for the current system.
So,
when you look at the unprecedented scale of modern ambitions, colonizing Mars, mapping the human connectome, developing artificial general intelligence, the capital required is just too vast. Even the wealthiest individuals can't fund it entirely out of pocket without unacceptable personal risk.
So they need outside money.
Exactly. They cannot rely solely on private wealth.
Yeah.
They must legally, systematically, and continuously co-opt public resources. The cultural mythology of the lone genius, that Tony Stark narrative, provides the ideological cover.
If the public believes that only this specific individual possesses the unique cognitive ability to save humanity,
then the public won't revolt when their tax dollars, their civic infrastructure, and their legal systems are rerouted to subsidize that individual's private corporation. The mythology is literally a mechanism to funnel public wealth into private hands without triggering democratic pushback.
wow. And we can see exactly how that funnel operates not just on a launch pad, but in the quiet, mundane machinery of local government.
Yeah, let's look at another narrative from the sources.
Let's look at Arthur. So the fluorescent lights of the municipal planning office are buzzing with this systemic, soul-crushing lethargy. It's a sound that had slowly drilled itself into Arthur's subconscious over 20 years of civic service.
We can all picture that exact office.
He sits at his gray laminate desk, picks up a heavy, brass-handled ink stamp, and presses it firmly against the final page of a massive document. It's titled the Civic Innovation Partnership Act.
And what does that stamp do?
With that single bureaucratic motion of his wrist, $500 million in taxpayer subsidies are effectively, irreversibly rerouted. They are bound for Marcus Sterling's new automated hyperlogistics hub. It's just gone. Arthur's hand lingers on the paper. He feels heavy, not with, cinematic anger, but with a hollow, deeply ingrained exhaustion. He manages the ledgers. He knows the math better than anyone. Marcus Sterling is currently smiling on the covers of 3 different business magazines, hailed as a rugged, visionary pioneer.
But the spreadsheet's still a different story.
Sterling hadn't risked a dime of his own capital on the physical infrastructure. To secure the municipal bonds required to build Sterling's tax-exempt, privately owned utopia, the city council had quietly passed austerity measures.
They had to cut budgets elsewhere.
Exactly. They slashed the budget for public sanitation and deferred maintenance on an aging water grid that was already leaking. It was a precise mathematical sacrifice. The foundations of the society had to be systematically neglected and drained to support the ambitions of one man.
The contrast there is brutal.
Worse. Arthur looks out his smudged window. Down below, at a concrete transit stop with a shattered glass shelter, tired workers are huddling under cheap umbrellas in the freezing, driving rain. The city buses on that route had been decommissioned last month to balance the municipal books and maintain the city's credit rating for Sterling's bonds.
Just so Sterling could build his hub.
Yeah. Arthur neatly aligns the edges of the act, files the paperwork into a gray manila folder, and places it in the outbox. He is actively participating in the quiet, legal theft of democracy, but he is entirely too paralyzed by the fear of losing his own fragile pension to utter a single word of protest.
That story, Arthur's physical exhaustion and the reality of those ledgers, exposes the exact economic mechanisms through which billionaire-driven progress operates.
It relies almost entirely on government funding and public risk.
Achieved without genuine democratic consent. And when we look at this structural inequality, the sources map it perfectly onto an old, dark concept known as the mudsill theory.
The mudsill theory. I've heard the term, but where does that originate?
It wasn't born in Silicon Valley, that's for sure. It was explicitly articulated in an 1858 Senate speech by James Henry Hammond of South Carolina.
1858, so he was defending the antebellum economic order.
Exactly. Hammond argued a blunt, brutal thesis. In every civilization, there must necessarily exist a foundational, subjugated lower class. He called this class the mudsill, referring to the lowest sill of a wooden foundation resting directly in the dirt.
And what was the purpose of this mudsill class?
They are required to perform all the menial, exhausting, and precarious labor. The vital function of this class is that their low-cost labor frees up the elevated, elite class to pursue progress, science, art, and high civilization.
Wow. So what we're seeing today is the exact resurrection of this antebellum political economy. It's just dressed up in the modern jargon of disruption and algorithmic efficiency.
When you order a package and it arrives the next morning, you aren't just engaging with a neutral supply chain. You are interacting with the modern mudsill Hammond described.
Right. The algorithm dictating that delivery driver's route, punishing them for taking a bathroom break, classifying them as an independent contractor to deny them health care. That algorithm is the modern enforcement mechanism.
It mathematically enforces the mudsill condition, ensuring their labor remains precarious and cheap. which frees up the massive capital required for the founder's space company or hyperlogistics hub.
And that space industry is the perfect macro example to scale up Arthur's municipal story.
The dominant cultural narrative of the new space race is that these rugged, visionary billionaires, tired of government bureaucracy, are using their own personal fortunes to push humanity to the stars.
But an examination of the legal and financial mechanisms reveals a massive structural influx of public funds into private hands.
To understand how this happened, we have to trace the timeline back to specific legislative shifts. First, in 2011, the United States government officially canceled the space shuttle program. NASA was directed to pivot, intentionally redirecting its funding and the responsibility for low Earth orbit logistics to the private sector.
So the government essentially created a guaranteed multi-billion-dollar captive market for private aerospace companies. Let me play devil's advocate here again, because the source material does present multiple sides, and you are painting this as pure extraction. Let's look at the actual outcomes of that 2011 decision. NASA's space launch system, the SLS program, was a bloated, bureaucratic nightmare. It was costing taxpayers billions for a rocket that was entirely disposable and years behind schedule.
Sure.
The private sector stepped in, utilized public contracts, yes, but they completely revolutionized the engineering. They figured out how to land orbital-class rocket boosters on autonomous drone ships in the middle of the ocean.
Which is an incredible feat.
Right. They slashed the cost of putting a kilogram of payload into orbit by a massive magnitude. So isn't this just a highly effective, necessary public-private partnership? Even if the guy at the top has a massive ego, didn't the government get exactly what it paid for? Cheaper, better access to space?
It is undeniable that the engineering achievements, particularly reusability, are monumental. However, the critique from our analysis isn't about the physics of the rockets. It's about the financial architecture and the legal ownership of the future.
Legal ownership.
While the companies achieved massive cost reductions, the development of those technologies was heavily de-risked by the taxpayer. The public paid for the foundational research, the launch infrastructure, and provided the guaranteed contracts that kept these companies solvent during their initial failures.
So the public took the risk.
But here's the critical pivot: who owns the outcome? This brings us to the second and arguably more crucial historical shift from the sources: the passage of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that 2015 act, because this is where the legal reality completely diverges from the public narrative.
Prior to 2015, the international legal framework for space was largely governed by the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, brokered through the UN. A core tenet of that treaty was the concept of res communis, the idea that outer space and celestial bodies are the common heritage of mankind.
So they couldn't be subject to national appropriation or private ownership. Space was a global commons.
Exactly. But the 2015 U.S. Space Act fundamentally shattered that legal landscape. It explicitly guaranteed private U.S. citizens and corporations the legal right to engage in the commercial exploration and recovery of space resources.
Really?
Yes. It stated that any materials extracted from an asteroid or celestial body could be legally owned, bought, and sold by the private entity that extracted them. The U.S. government unilaterally bypassed the international consensus to establish private property rights in space.
So the taxpayer funded the 60 years of rocketry research required to get us there. But the moment we arrive at an asteroid rich in platinum or cobalt, the private corporation gets to plant their flag and claim the profits.
It's the literal privatization of the cosmos.
And it exposes the massive logical flaw in this model of progress. If the financial costs and the sheer engineering risk of mapping neural pathways or building orbital habitats are far too immense for any individual billionaire to actually fund on their own, which the government contracts prove they are, doesn't that inherently require a massive centralized entity like a democratic government to accomplish?
Yes.
So if these billionaires are essentially creating giant private NGOs solely to siphon public resources, they aren't replacing the slow government. They're acting as a parasitic nervous system, overriding the democratic host.
That structural capture is the exact danger highlighted in the text. Traditional democratic theory argues that if the public bears the risk and provides the capital, the public should universally reap the rewards. The outcome should be a public good.
But the ultimate goals of this billionaire-directed progress are not designed to yield universally accessible benefits.
The architecture of their future is actively, intentionally designed to leave the ordinary human behind.
Which brings us to the ultimate destination of all this capital. It isn't just rockets and logistics hubs. The final frontier they are trying to conquer is biology itself.
Transhumanism.
Let's listen to the setting of this third scenario from the material. The centripetal hum of a blood filtration centrifuge is the only sound in this sterile, aggressively temperature-controlled recovery suite.
Sounds very clinical.
Elena is standing perfectly still, carefully adjusting an intravenous line. It's feeding a highly experimental synthetic telomerase compound directly into the vein of a sleeping venture capitalist. He's 52 years old, but according to the biometric readouts glowing above his head, his biological markers are aggressively rewinding toward 30.
Humanity's next evolutionary step, as the PR releases would call it.
A triumph over the organic limits of human flesh. But Elena is staring at this pristine, platinum-grade medical tubing, and a sudden wave of profound resentment washes over her. It's quickly repressed by a numb, aching fatigue.
Why is she so fatigued?
Because just 2 hours prior, during her legally mandated but entirely unpaid 30-minute lunch break, she was sitting in a stairwell on the phone with her health insurance provider. She was begging an automated voice system for authorization for a generic asthma inhaler for her 8-year-old daughter. Denied by a labyrinth of automated clauses and out-of-pocket deductibles she could never afford on her clinic salary. She looks back at the man sleeping comfortably in the chair. He is literally conquering death. He is unilaterally redefining the parameters of human flourishing with resources that could fund entire hospital systems.
And she can't even get an inhaler for her kid.
Meanwhile, the woman tasked with monitoring his vitals can't afford the basic chemical mechanics of breath for her own child. The billionaire gospel dictates his enhancement is a victory for the human species. The wealth funneling upward is necessary so he can cure aging for everyone eventually. But Elena wipes a tear of sheer physical exhaustion from her cheek. She feels absolutely no awe for this engineered demigod. She feels only the cold, creeping realization that the glorious future he's funding has fundamentally defined her and her daughter as structurally obsolete.
Elena's realization highlights the core ideological conflict of our era. Transhumanism, as defined by billionaires, directly challenges classical definitions of human flourishing.
How does it challenge them exactly?
Well, it prioritizes extreme technological enhancement of the individual over universally accessible welfare gains for the community. If we look back to antiquity Aristotle, the concept of eudaimonia, the classical definition of human flourishing, was inherently communal.
It involved the betterment of the polis, right? Civic participation.
Yes, ethical relationships, the elevation of the entire society. You could not flourish in a vacuum while the city burned around you. But transhumanism shifts this focus entirely. It views the human body not as part of a social fabric, but as a flawed platform requiring a hardware upgrade.
Extension of lifespan, augmentation of cognition.
Merging consciousness with digital architecture. Enhancements that are, by their very economic nature, only available to the ultra-wealthy individuals who can afford them.
And the scientific jargon masks the brutal economic reality, like what Elena was administering, synthetic telomerase. Telomeres are essentially the protective caps at the end of our DNA strands. Every time a cell divides, those caps get a little shorter.
The biological mechanism of aging.
Right. To develop an enzyme to reverse that requires billions in highly specialized research, the idea that a treatment costing that much would ever trickle down to the mudsill class, to someone who can't even get generic albuterol approved, is absurd. It's an engineered biological divide.
And they wrap this brutal reality in an ideology known as long-termism. It operates almost exactly like a new fundamentalist religion.
A religious drama of disaster and salvation.
Exactly. Long-termism relies on a massive scale of utilitarian mathematics. The ideology argues that the vast majority of human value lies in the deep future. If humanity survives and colonizes the galaxy, there could be trillions of technologically enhanced humans living thousands of years from now.
So their mathematical probability heavily outweighs the suffering of the few billion organic humans currently alive today.
The elite preach that the Earth is a ticking time bomb destined for destruction via an asteroid strike or rogue AI. The profound irony is they ignore how their own economic extraction is actively accelerating the environmental demise they claim to fear.
And within this framework, they position themselves as the saviors,
proposing that the only salvation is off-world, colonizing Mars or living in orbital environments. Extreme wealth inequality is morally justified because hoarding that wealth is supposedly the only way to fund the miracles required for deep future salvation.
But that mathematical justification requires the complete eradication of a core human trait, The logic of long-termism explicitly disdains empathy.
Prominent voices within this elite circle have publicly described excessive empathy as a civilizational suicide risk.
They argue that focusing too much on the suffering of the poor acts as a weakness, draining resources away from the vital engineering of the future. But if you look at actual anthropology, evolutionary biology, empathy, and cooperation are literally the only mechanisms that prevented humanity from destroying itself.
We survived precisely because we did not abandon the world.
Right. We shared our fire, pooled our resources, but this modern disdain for empathy didn't emerge in a vacuum, did it?
No, it is the logical endpoint of a much broader historical trajectory. The sources connect this to the historian Lynn White's foundational critique of Western technoscience. White argued that specific interpretations of theology and the scientific revolution fundamentally altered how humanity viewed its relationship with the environment.
Nature ceased to be viewed as a subject with intrinsic value and was redefined entirely as an object.
If a forest is just an object, a standing reserve of timber, you can clear-cut it without moral negotiation. The technological worldview reduces everything to raw material and measurable output.
And now we are seeing the exact extension of that mindset applied directly to the human population.
If ordinary humans are viewed through this lens, as objects, data points, commodities, or merely a temporary biological stepping stone for the next phase of evolution, then their present suffering is mathematically irrelevant. They are just the raw material required to build the transhumanist future.
This exposes a massive flaw in their entire narrative of being the heroes of progress. In traditional storytelling, heroes are celebrated for successfully engaging with and improving reality. They fight the monster, heal the land, bring fire to the tribe.
But the modern tech hero is celebrated for explicitly rejecting reality.
They aren't trying to heal the ecosystem. They are pouring billions into building private castles and underground bunkers in New Zealand to escape the very world their economic models ruined. So, if we follow their logic to its absolute conclusion, if their definition of humanity's future only includes enhanced cyborgs in the deep future, aren't they technically advocating for the extinction of the human race as it currently exists?
That is the inevitable, logical endpoint of their ideology. If the organic human is merely a flawed precursor, if obsolescence is not a tragedy, it's the goal. However, this blatant disregard for the working majority cannot be sustained by force alone.
Society only tolerates this wealth extraction because a meticulously crafted moral and legal framework has convinced the public to accept it.
To understand exactly how that legal framework was constructed and how we lost the tools to fight it, we have to examine the history of what scholars call constitutional political economy.
Right, because Arthur in the municipal office and Elena in the clinic didn't just naturally agree to be the mudsill. They have to be convinced that the system is fair or inevitable. The law had to be weaponized to protect the elite. So how did the Constitution get twisted into an instrument of oligarchy?
We must look at a largely forgotten American tradition that legal scholars call the democracy of opportunity. In modern times, we tend to view the Constitution purely structurally, 3 branches of government, negative rights like free speech.
But from the early American Republic through the New Deal, there was a different understanding.
A profound understanding that the Constitution's political guarantees were inextricably intertwined with the structure of economic life. Extreme wealth inequality was viewed as a direct existential threat to the Republican form of government.
We need to see the mechanism of how they fought this. Give me the historical precedent from the sources.
Let's look at the Jacksonian era in the 1830s. There were visceral political fights against the paper money system and the Second Bank of the United States. Jacksonian reformers believed the bank's ability to control currency allowed an unelected elite to dictate the economic fate of the nation.
They argued that equal protection of the laws explicitly meant protecting the many against class legislation that privileged the wealthy few.
They viewed the bank's monopoly as unconstitutional class warfare. Fast forward a century to the Great Depression, and FDR weaponized this exact same legal theory. He openly declared war on economic royalists.
He argued that a small group of corporate elites had concentrated control over other people's property and labor, creating a new industrial dictatorship.
And FDR explicitly laid out the mechanism. Political equality is entirely meaningless in the face of massive economic inequality. The prevailing understanding of the New Deal era was that the government had an affirmative constitutional duty to actively structure the economy, regulate monopolies, empower unions, redistribute wealth.
To sustain a broad middle class and permanently prevent the rise of a moneyed aristocracy. So what happened to that duty? How did we completely lose that legal tradition?
The historical pivot occurred during the Great Society era of the 1960s. Coming out of the post-WWII economic boom, America was experiencing unprecedented shared prosperity. Because of the New Deal reforms, a vast middle class emerged.
But the architects of the Great Society made a fatal assumption.
They looked at the soaring GDP and believed the foundational problems of class structure and wealth distribution had been permanently solved by the engine of endless economic growth.
So they thought the economic engine was permanently fixed, so they stopped worrying about how it worked and just focused on letting more people into the car.
Exactly. The legal and political focus shifted entirely to the inclusionary tradition. The vital fights of the 1960s were about fighting group-based exclusion through anti-discrimination law, dismantling Jim Crow, opening opportunities to minorities and women. This was profound, necessary work.
But in dedicating all political capital to inclusion, they abandoned the democracy of opportunity tradition that focused on structural class inequality.
They believed continuous growth would pay for the war on poverty without ever needing to engage in wealth redistribution or breaking up corporate power. So when the economic paradigm violently shifted, deindustrialization, globalization, deregulation in the 70s and 80s, the legal framework to fight oligarchy had been entirely forgotten.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Into that unregulated space steps what we now recognize as market fundamentalism, backed by a secular prosperity gospel. The ruling class has to impose a moral hegemony to convince the public that the new, brutal inequality is deeply moral.
Under this gospel, the public is rigorously taught to view immense wealth as the ultimate manifestation of moral virtue, intelligence, and productivity. The market is treated as a flawless arbiter of human worth.
Conversely, poverty or economic struggle is framed entirely as a personal, moral failure. It is an incredibly powerful ideological tool of subjugation.
If you are struggling to afford an asthma inhaler for your child, it is not because the healthcare system is mathematically designed to funnel resources to billionaires. It is because you, personally, did not work hard enough or fail to optimize your life.
The COVID-19 pandemic provided a stark, horrifying historical case study of this moral framework operating at maximum capacity. When the global economy locked down, a specific class of people were deemed essential workers, grocery clerks, delivery drivers, meat packers.
They were forced to remain in life-threatening conditions before vaccines were available.
And this was all politically justified under the guise of freedom. But whose freedom was it? The legal mechanism used to force them back to work was brutal. Workers were explicitly barred from receiving unemployment benefits if they refused to return to an unsafe workplace. The choice was engineered: risk a deadly virus or face immediate eviction and starvation.
And while that working class faced engineered coercion, the financial mechanisms operating at the top created the largest upward transfer of wealth in modern history. Billionaire wealth surged by trillions of dollars, while essential workers saw real wages stagnate.
It's directly comparable to historical religious frameworks. The church used the threat of hellfire to ensure compliance. Today, the immediate threat of homelessness and starvation enforces compliance to the market,
allowing the elite to extract unprecedented wealth during a global crisis without facing a general strike.
This brings us to a crucial philosophical distinction from the sources about freedom. Specifically, Isaiah Berlin's concept of negative liberty. The idea of freedom is simply the absence of external interference. I want to apply a direct analogy here. We are constantly told we live in a free society because we all have the equal freedom to dine at the most expensive restaurant in the world. The law doesn't discriminate. The police won't physically stop me from walking through the front door.
Right, no legal barrier.
But this completely ignores the material reality that freedom, without the currency required to exercise it, is just a cruel philosophical taunt. If a plate of food costs more than my monthly rent, the fact that I am legally allowed to buy it is an empty promise.
That analogy cuts to the core of the legal critique. The modern judicial system has overwhelmingly embraced this hollow, formalist version of negative liberty,
severing the concept of freedom from the material reality of economic power.
And this interpretation has been heavily weaponized by the courts to dismantle democratic protections. Look at the legal gymnastics of campaign finance rulings, culminating in Citizens United.
The Supreme Court established that spending money to influence an election is a form of protected speech. They argue everyone has the equal freedom to spend billions of dollars to broadcast their opinions.
Let's break down how absurd this mechanism is. If I have the constitutional right to speak, the court says I must have the right to buy a megaphone to amplify my voice.
Come back.
But then they extrapolate that to say, if I have the right to buy a megaphone, I must have the absolute right to buy a $50 million television network or fund an unlimited super PAC to drown out every other citizen.
Therefore, restricting my ability to spend $50 million is an unconstitutional restriction of my free speech.
By treating the deployment of massive capital as a protected civil liberty, they legally protect oligarchic influence, while entirely dismantling the actual democratic opportunity for the average citizen who doesn't have $1 billion lying around.
It is using the sacred language of liberty to legally construct an aristocracy.
And when we connect the mechanics of that legal interpretation back to the broader picture, we understand why the loss of the democracy of opportunity tradition is so catastrophic. The failure to recognize extreme wealth as a structural threat has allowed the mechanisms of our government to be captured.
We have legally and culturally surrendered our definition of progress to a moneyed oligarchy. So when we synthesize all of this, from the historical echoes of monarchs claiming divine right, to the municipal ledgers draining public infrastructure, to the transhumanist clinics rewriting biology, and the courts equating billions with free speech, what is the ultimate realization from this deep dive?
The synthesis of these mechanisms presents a chilling conclusion. The true consequence of surrendering our definition of human progress to a moneyed oligarchy is not merely the political loss of democratic control. It is the literal structural erasure of our shared humanity.
The erasure of humanity itself.
Yes. As the elite consolidate their power and construct their bespoke privatized futures, whether isolating in orbital habitats or extending lifespans in transhumanist clinics, they are actively mathematically leaving behind a society where the basic mechanics of survival are mercilessly commodified for everyone else.
They are essentially building an escape pod, a lifeboat off a sinking ship. But they used our tax dollars, our infrastructure, and our labor to build it. And they have absolutely no intention of letting us on board.
The ultimate danger is not that their grand science fiction visions of the future will fail. The profound danger is that their specific version of progress will succeed exactly as they have designed it.
Rendering the vast majority of us structurally obsolete.
Exactly. Reducing ordinary people to mere footnotes in a narrative of progress that was explicitly designed to exclude them.
We used to measure human progress by how much light it brought to the darkness, like electrifying the world, fundamentally changing and elevating the daily lives of ordinary people. But now we are being forced to participate in a modern fan fiction written entirely by capital, where progress is exclusively measured by how far the elite can separate themselves from the rest of us.